just like it was for some of the people that were sitting there in the center with me. And as I sat there for hours while my blood was getting cleaned with Leanne next to me, something wonderful happened to Leanne and I at the same time. I tried to pray for healing, but I couldn't. I'm not totally sure why, because I always pray for healing when I or another family member or someone that I know is sick. It's a regular part of my prayer life. But this time, as much as I wanted my kidneys to work, I didn't feel compelled to pray that prayer. I just couldn't. I looked over at the others for whom dialysis is a normal part of their life and wondered, why not me? Perhaps this is my path to be on. Would God stop being good if that happened? And both Leanne and I were almost simultaneously flooded with the peace that God's goodness was not dependent on my kidneys ever working again. My thoughts went to the first Bible verse I learned in my life. It was the first verse I learned as a young child because my parents taught us Bible verses that started with each corresponding letter in the alphabet. So we learned the alphabet, we learned the verse. And little did I know how much I would need that verse 40 years later, sitting in that dialysis center. If you'd like a list of all the 26 verses that correspond with each letter of the alphabet, you can go to our website and download it free for yourself or to teach your children. And that first verse, the one that starts with an A, says this. It's Romans 8:28. And it would usher in a peace that would meet me right where I was. It says, and we know that all things work together for good to those that love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. I'm so glad Bill unpacked that verse a few weeks ago. It's fresh in our minds. I grew up seeing that verse to be true in my life all around me. When my dad was incorrectly incarcerated by Manuel Noriega secret police in Panama, I heard my dad stand in front of the church and give testimony about the good that came out of that whole scary 3-day incident. When my mom almost passed away from internal bleeding, I saw her give testimony about how God turned that into good in her life. My parents passed it on to me. I'm passing it on to my children. And even more recently, I'm learning this truth from other precious people in my life. There's a member of my small group that meets every Saturday night after the service. Hopefully we'll meet again tonight. She's a 22-year survivor of a stroke that left her right side partially paralyzed. And even though she grew up in a pastor's home, she didn't embrace Jesus until 9 months after her stroke. She told our group that the stroke created a set of circumstances that in fact helped lead her to Jesus. But after coming to Christ, she prayed for 4 years that God would heal her. And when he didn't, she got angry with God and stayed that way for years. And then she reached a point of acceptance. But she was quick to point out that it was not the same as acquiescence, which had a defeatist, hopeless tone to it. It was acceptance with hope that God is still good and that he would stand true to his promise to make good come out of it. And today, she no longer feels compelled to pray for healing. She's content to know that with Jesus in her life, she's good to go with anything that comes her way, including being partially paralyzed for the rest of her life. And this weekend, she stands as testimony to how God has turned even this into good into her life for so many years. I love her name. It's Joy. Joy Ray. A very accurate description of what radiates out of her. She's in my heart's list of spiritual heroes. You remember the account of in the New Testament of Jesus calming the storm? The Bible says that Jesus and his disciples were in a boat crossing the sea when a great storm caught him by surprise. Well, Jesus was asleep in the boat as the storm grew, and the disciples were starting to freak out, thinking that they were all going to die. And so they went and quickly woke up Jesus, and he stood up and he calmed the storm. But I've often wondered, even as a child, I often wondered something about that story. Right at the end, when the boat must have been rocking really fast, was Jesus really asleep before they woke him up in that last moment? I mean, I certainly don't know. But I wonder if Jesus let them think he was asleep, wanting to see how they were going to react to the storm. Truth is, I want to live a life that is not in denial of the storm, but one that lives in greater assurance that with Jesus in my boat, I'm all right. Jesus calls us all to go over in the midst of the storm and not freak out, but go and take a nap next to him, because he knows there is no safer place to be than right next to Jesus. So, if regular dialysis was to be a part of my life from here on out, we could rest in God's amazing goodness along the way. If that's what it took to get Davy and I back to shore, we were good with that. His grace would be sufficient. His love would be enduring. His plans for our lives would not be derailed at all. That his words in Jeremiah 29:11 would still be true for us when he said, "For I know the plans that I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future." And so this day, I want to remind all of us of that fact, that God can and will make all things work together for good to those who love God, to them who are called according to his purpose. It doesn't matter how bad the circumstances are. Nothing is beyond the reach of God's expertise of making good come out of anything when we put those circumstances into his hand. And to help sear this into our consciousness in a way that I hope you will never forget, I want to ask you to stand up if you have personally experienced God turn something terrible into good in your life. Please stand if you can give witness to that in your life experience, something terrible into good. Take a look around. Take a look around. Embed this image in the hard drive of your memory. To those of you who are considering the faith or are new in the faith, this is the promise that is in store for you. To those of you that have been walking with Jesus a long time, sear this into your memory as well, this picture. Because one thing I know that's true for all of us, sitting, standing, whatever, tough times are going to be ahead. We've not all seen the last of tough times in our life. So remember this. Remember God's goodness. Thank you. You can be seated. One final theme before we close this service is love. I've often wondered, what was it that Davy did that caused me to turn into an absolute raving lunatic, willing to sacrifice myself in an instant if it meant saving him? Picture on the side screens was taken moments before this whole thing happened. I've looked at that picture a lot. It's like I want to jump in the screen and yell, "Don't go in, stop, whatever you do." My daughter discovered this a few weeks afterwards, showed it to me. It would be moments after this picture was taken that I thought I was about to witness the death of my son, and I remember what it did inside of me. It did turn me into an irrational, raving lunatic to try to save his life. I was not thinking very logically. What I did not mention to you before was that the first thing that I did upon realizing I didn't have enough strength to get Davy back to the shore, it was almost like my last act, was that I grabbed him, mustered all the strength that I had, and I threw him in the direction of the beach. It was as if I was trying to throw him the entire 50 yards onto the shore, because that's all I had left. It was only when he mushed about 3 feet closer to the beach that I thought, that ain't gonna work. We need a plan B. I know, let's push him. By the way, Davy was fine physically, but he was processing a lot of emotions. On the way back in the van, he was in Leon's arms saying, "The thoughts, Mom, the thoughts, I can't get the thoughts out of my mind." This last year's New Year's Eve, our family did what many of you do on New Year's Eve, and that is you kind of review the highs and lows of the year, and we had a few. And when it came time to Davy's turn, he went to his room, and he brought back his journal and read from his entry for July 16. Here is an audio recording of him reading that entry, which he said would be okay for you to hear.